Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the latest episode of Inspire the Mind. As you know, we interview people who are all involved one way or another with mental health, well-being, doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, advocates, and campaigners. So I'm really excited this week to be chatting to Millie Gooch. And actually, I checked with Millie beforehand. I've pronounced her name right. Yeah, and Millie is really inspiring, and she set up the Sober Girl Society, and she's an advocate for the idea, really, that you can have a good time, but you don't need to get drunk. You can stay sober. And this is something really interesting to me with teenage children, and just how ubiquitous alcohol is and how it's used in our sort of social lives. So really excited to chat to Millie. So greetings, Millie. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. So I've just done a sort of tiny little brief intro to you there. Can we just start a little bit more about your motivation and what led to setting up Sober Girl Society? Why does it matter so much to you?
Yeah, of course. So my relationship with alcohol kind of really started when I went to university. And I always say it was really strange because it was kind of just expected. You kind of go into higher education. I remember in my freshers welcome pack, I had a shot glass and I had, it was a pub crawl and things like that. And I quickly got really entrenched in this kind of binge drinking culture that is kind of sold to us when we go to university. And I wasn't a very big drinker when I was, before 18. So I kind of went to university. It was my first taste of nightlife experience, and just, got really kind of entrenched in this nightlife culture. Started drinking very heavily, binge drinking. I kind of went from no drinking to really kind of blackout drinking. And then when I left university, I always say that alcohol kind of morphed for me into something that I just did because everyone else did and it was kind of socially expected, to something that I then started to use differently. So I started to use it for confidence. I really started suffering with my mental health kind of in my mid-20s. So I really started using it for anxiety, and if I was feeling insecure or nervous or going on a date or all those things that you do as a millennial, I started using alcohol in kind of a different way for more emotional reasons rather than just because everyone did it. And then I really started to notice the effect that it was having on my mental health. So I would go out, I would, black out. At the time, it was programs like Geordie Shore were kind of rising through the ranks, and it was, that go hard or go home mentality. So I would wake up in places and not remember huge parts of my night. I would put myself in vulnerable situations. I was waking up in places and kind of not knowing where I was. And it really started to take a toll on my mental health. So I was really suffering with anxiety, really suffering with depression. And I just found it really kind of hard to escape from, even though I didn't see myself as kind of clinically addicted because I wasn't waking up in the morning and it was the first thing I thought of. But when I did drink in that kind of Friday, Saturday binge drinking mentality, I would spend the rest of the week kind of recovering from it. And there wasn't really any information out there on kind of how to quit or how to stop for people like me. And I know a lot more now, but at the time I kind of thought AA was my only route. And I thought, actually, if I go in there and say, I can go a few weeks without drinking, but when I do drink, I can't stop. And I think I'm a real binge drinking party girl. I thought, well, they're going to laugh me out. So I went out on a night out in February 2018 and just woke up horrendously hungover and just said, I need to do something about this. It's just causing chaos in my life. My mental health is kind of really on the floor. And I couldn't find kind of help, but I said, I'm going to do it for me. And I did it for 6 months. I didn't drink and I really stuck to it. And I think people always think, I just made a decision and that was it. I'd gone back and forth. I'd done many dry January, many sober October. I tried to kind of stop before. And then I kind of looked around on the internet for people like me, because I always said, even though some of my friends are really supportive, they didn't necessarily get it. I couldn't speak to people about, how do you go on a night out and not drink? How do you go on a date sober? And what's a good alcohol-free wine? I didn't really have anyone to talk to about it. So I thought, well, I know how to use social media. I will set up an Instagram account and maybe there will will be people like me who kind of want to talk about this subject, and in a different way to kind of perhaps the conversation that we have that is just around this kind of rock bottom drinking. You know, I want to talk to girls who actually it's affecting their mental health. And so I started it. And that was kind of the motivation behind it. It was a tool that I needed, let alone anyone else. And it just escalated from there, really, and turned it into my full-time job.
That's amazing. So just just so much there to sort of unpack. So just rewinding. I've sort of got my old journalist hat. I used to work at the time. So just going back over your journey, which you've just beautifully encapsulated there. So where did you go? Where were you brought up? Where did you go to university?
So I was brought up in a place called Gravesend, which is in Kent, and then I went to the University of Sussex, which is in Brighton. So I'd gone from quite a small town to like this kind of like big city, really, where there was like a lot of clubs and very like kind of boozy nightlife, whereas where I'm from in Kent, not really.
Fascinating. All right. And what were you studying at Sussex?
English literature and language.
Okay, perfect, because I know you're a writer and a journalist as well. So I'm just interested on that pivot, as you say, that kind of normalization of alcohol when you arrive at uni, and maybe, you know, parents listening will be really interested. So before that point, you might have had a drink at a party, but it wasn't really part of your everyday life in the way that it became quite quickly at uni. Would that be fair?
And also, so I'm an August birthday, so I'm like the youngest in my year. So I literally turned 18, and then 3 weeks later I went to university. So I hadn't really, like, some of my friends that had, you know, turned 18 like in the September before were going out and going to clubs, but I couldn't because I didn't have an ID. So it was literally my first experience of turning 18. I kind of did it away from home as like an adult for the first time. So I didn't even kind of not necessarily learn to drink, but have that kind of experimentation before I went to university.
Because that's really interesting, because I know from doing sort of running workshops in schools, because I work with, I run Singing in the Rain workshops as somebody who's had depression myself and now shares sort of psychological tools. And I think certainly parents in schools are really interested about that sort of transition and what is the best way? Should we be more like the French and having a little bit to drink at home? So as you say, you don't have this sort of sudden switch when you arrive at uni.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting, actually, and it's a complex conversation because I do think there would be a benefit to kind of introducing it in a more sensible way, because I had gone from a nothing drinker to then going to university where the drinking mentality is so the other way of real binge drinking, you know, like sports societies, and you know, we see so many kind of like university accidents and deaths from this kind of drinking. I do think that they probably have it figured out a bit more in that kind of European approach, but then I also don't think it's good to necessarily normalize drinking at an early age. But I think because I always say I never tried drinking sensibly, I never tested my limits, I just went straight to university, and people were saying, you know, it was triple vodka Red Bulls for £1.50, so that was how I was drinking. So it's, I think, I mean, I went to university and I started in 2009, and I think there has been a bit of a change since then of, you know, like what drink stills they can promote and things like that. So I think there has been a little bit of a shift, but when I first went, it was that was just the mentality of when you first went, it was real binge drinking.
And when, just to drill down, you know, when you say like the experience of drinking heavily, like binge drinking, what does that really mean? I mean, I know there's this whole thing of prees, like you drink before you go out, you like have a couple of spirit shots, would that be fair? And then what actually does it mean?
Well, I think this is a problem as well of being a student, is you don't want to spend much on a night out, so you do drink heavily before you even go out. So I mean, we used to get like a bottle of wine from Tesco each. That would be like a pre-drink, and then we would kind
of wine each,
like a really cheap bottle of wine from Tesco. We would drink that, and then we would go out. There was like a bar that it was called the £10 meal deal, and it was 2 drinks, 2 shots and 2 Jaeger bombs for £10. So then we used to do that before we even got into the club.
Sorry, so what are Jaeger bombs?
Jaeger bombs are Jägermeister in a like glass with Red Bull in, so you do them. Okay, so it's another shot. So binge drinking, I would say, like, is very quick drinking lots of shots, drinking, you know, very quickly over a short period of time. That is what we used to do, is just drink so quickly. And like, I mean, the triple vodka Red Bulls that we used to get 2 and then put them into a pint glass, so it would be like 6 vodka Red Bulls. And it wasn't just like it was me doing it, it was everyone doing it, so it just seemed so normal at the time.
No, look, I'm really interested in this because I know my own children have had the same experience at university, and I've been absolutely sort of amazed because I've got a daughter who's, well, you're, how old are you now? You're probably
30 now.
Okay, so she's a little bit younger than you, but and I can't quite tell, but she's quite little.
Yeah,
I'm quite little, and
I'm little.
just the sheer volume of alcohol for somebody quite small. I mean, it's a lot of alcohol. I mean, I don't know if you actually, I don't know, maybe now you know more about the topic. Like, I mean, there are obviously drinking guidelines and units of alcohol. I don't know what, did you ever kind of know exactly how many units or any of that, or?
I never totted it up, but it was definitely like in one night way over the 14 that they recommend for a week, for sure. But and again, I'm quite small as well, so I would drink very kind of like quickly, and I think I was affected more than some other people would have been.
Okay. And it is a really interesting area, isn't it? Because you said, okay, so you had a heavy sort of drinking experience at university, but it's actually, and you might have thought that's where the problem started, but what you're saying is actually it was after you left uni that, in fact, you felt that it was really getting out of hand.
Yeah, I think because when I first started drinking, I didn't realize that people kind of use drinking as like an emotional tool. I just thought it was for fun and for a laugh and because everyone else kind of did it. And then when I left university, I went to work. First of all, I went to work in PR, and then I went to work in journalism. And both industries are very booze heavy, and I was constantly going to like parties and giving free champagne. And especially when I worked for PR, a lot of them looked after like booze brands as well. So we used to have like free Friday bar. And I think very slowly and without me even realizing, I started to use alcohol slightly differently, in that like I'd had a stressful week at work, or I would want to have a drink, you know, I'd got my heart broken, so I would want to have a drink. Those kind of things, I started using it for an emotional kind of escape. I would say it was definitely a form of escapism. I've got a very busy brain. I'm always thinking, I'm always like switched on. I get really bad anxiety. And for me, drinking was like just like a calm, like a silence. So if I was getting all stressed and pent up, drinking really relaxed me. And I just had a one-track mind when I was drinking. It wasn't like so many things. And I think I was just constantly around it, but it was so normalized. At no point did anyone say to me, I think you might have a problem, because everyone was doing it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So just if anybody's switched on, I'm chatting to Millie Gooch here, who started the Sober Girls Society, and we're just talking about drinking. Millie's just made a really interesting distinction between like drinking for fun at uni to sort of drinking for sort of comfort and for sort of an emotional release. But I mean, playing a bit devil's advocate here, I mean, you might say that's a good thing. All cultures have had all around the world forever, there's always been a culture of fermented alcohol, and that idea of stress release. I mean, I did one bit of research I read was that actually, if you can use alcohol for sort of relaxation, that's fine, because it's got some good aspects to it. For one aspect, it's got a sociability aspect, which is that it's often with other people, and that's good for our mental health. The problem seems to be, and I don't know if this is your experience, is that you can't stop. So you have a couple of glasses, and actually, for example, well, in fact, we might need to talk to some more doctors here, but maybe are there health benefits to alcohol in moderation?
So it's a very complex argument. So I would totally agree with what you're saying in terms of like there can be benefits. I think for me it was that escapism then turned to avoidance, and I think there's a fine line. Like everyone's got their method of escapism, whether that is watching trash TV, whether that is drinking wine, whether that is the gym. But I think for me, I wasn't dealing with that stuff at all. So rather than addressing the root cause of kind of those mental health issues or the stress or things like that, I would just drink, push it all down and completely avoid it. So it wasn't necessarily just, a light escapism, which I think, is really healthy for us. We all do need to escape, especially in a world like this that is so switched on. But for me, it was complete avoidance. And then in terms of the health benefits, so there are a few studies out there that kind of say, you know, it's good for your heart and cardiovascular properties and things like that. But actually a lot of that they've kind of proven is like the grape juice in wine. I think that's where it comes from. So if you want to get the benefits, you can get them elsewhere rather than it being counted out by the negative effects of the alcohol, if that makes sense. So I always say,
the sort of flavonoids and things like that, isn't it?
Yeah, and like resveratrol, and yeah, I always say it's a bit like saying, you know, like a bleach covered apple is healthy. Like, yeah, the apple is healthy, but it's, you know, it's covered in the bad stuff, so you're going to get the negative effects of that as well. So it kind of counteracts it. As they say, if you're drinking red wine for those properties, like, no, that's not helpful. And I always say it's not my mission in the world to make everyone go sober, and I don't think a lot of people like necessarily need to, but I think everyone can have kind of like a more mindful approach to alcohol and understanding and things like that. I think there's so much that we kind of don't really talk about alcohol, especially in terms of the kind of mental health effects. I think
I'm really struck. I think you really nailed it there. It's really interesting, that idea about sort of a kind of curiosity and like kind of questioning your motives, like as you say, is it just a sort of light-hearted escapism for a couple of hours, which may be fine, or is it actually a refusal to really work out, you know, what's behind it, the fact that there's some serious issues going on. And I read an interesting survey just ahead of chatting to you, because I'm really interested in this topic of this idea that addiction is about distraction. So that you, whether it's alcohol or drugs or work or whatever it is, sex addiction, whatever addiction, it's to do with not being able to accept, or I don't really like the word tolerate because it's got a rather judgmental vibe to it, but it's about not being able to accept the present reality. So you distract yourself. I'm playing around with language here because we just talked about escapism and said that's more or less okay. But why is it okay to distract yourself? I don't know. It's not okay because you're not actually then going to really work out what's really going on. Is that the argument?
Yeah, I think so. I think by, you know, just glossing over it with this kind of like just drinking if you're stressed or depressed or anxious, it's really hard, I think, then to get to the root cause of what is causing that. So I think you are just kind of like avoiding it, and then at some point it is going to come up. I mean, this is why we see so many people like have drunk arguments or drunk crying, because I always say it's like a beach ball, you're like holding it down, and then at some point it is going to come up if you're not dealing with it. And I think it comes up, you know, on nights out, we see it with people. That's why there's so many kind of emotional outbursts. So I do think distraction is good to a point, but then I think you actually have to deal with that stuff. Otherwise it is going to come out, and it's going to come out in the wrong way. It's going to come out in a breakdown. It's going to come out in burnout. It's going to come out you screaming at someone when you shouldn't be. I think that's the important thing, is distraction is healthy for a bit, but it just, as long as it doesn't cross into avoidance and that you're avoiding feeling those feelings.
So I suppose there are 2 points there. There's the point that distraction means you don't address the underlying issues. But I suppose there's a second point, that the means of distraction in itself has got some problems attached, because, you know, drinking in excess has major health implications.
Yeah, and the whole thing that's really hard as well is, so nowadays mental health conditions and substance abuse are so hard to untangle. Like, it's a bit like chicken and egg, what came first? Because if I went to a doctor, I'd say, well, I'm drinking because I'm really anxious, but actually alcohol makes me really anxious because of the way that alcohol chemically affects your brain. So because the next day I feel anxious, then I want to drink. And it is so hard. Like, with a lot of mental health conditions, a lot of people are kind of using substances to kind of mask the symptoms, but then they make them worse, and then they get into this real cycle, which is where I was, where I was feeling really anxious, really depressed, and I thought, I know what would cheer me up and calm me down: drinking. So I would go out, and then the next day I'd wake up and I would feel even worse, and then by the end of the week I would do it again, and I was just in this cycle of like drinking, being anxious, drinking, being anxious. And it was really hard to untangle what came first, because they kind of happened at the same time. When I look back, I wasn't really necessarily an anxious child, but I was quite anxious when I was at university, and whether it was, I was away from home for the first time, or it was that because I started drinking, then I started feeling more more anxiety, and because of that I started drinking more. So it becomes really hard to entangle. And in this day and age, once you get to quite a serious stage, a lot of people are like pushed between kind of like substance abuse care and mental health care, because it's really hard to untangle what came first and what is the problem. So we have to really advise people, if they are really suffering with their mental health conditions, that they need to kind of cut back on the substances first, so that we can work out actually what the root cause is.
It's such a good point, sort of disentangle those two. I remember, so I'm like you, I don't drink. I stopped drinking when I was about 19 because I passed out, and being small, and I was so frightening passing out, that I only had to do it once, and I then pretty much stopped. So I became very good over the years to sort of like tipping drinks into pot plants, because I noticed when I told people, I stopped telling people I didn't drink because there was such pressure to drink, and then people thought you had a real problem and you didn't want to get into that whole conversation. But sorry, just coming back to you. So, oh yeah, I know what I was going to say. So I briefly was using, thought that, you know, if I drank, then I'd get over insomnia, because I would fall asleep. But exactly as you're saying, this sort of commingling of underlying symptoms, and then the abuse, you know, whatever you're taking to address it, then they're muddling up. You'd then wake at 3 or 4 in the morning feeling really anxious.
Yeah.
So you'd had the glass of wine to get to sleep, and then actually you'd be worse off than if you'd never had it. So listen, so I'm just interested. So you so clear how you're describing it, and I want to come back to sort of, as you say, treating the underlying mental health issue versus treating the substance abuse. But just in your own personal story, was there a sort of a one moment and you said, right, I've got to stop this? Because I think from working with some of my mental health charities and talking to people on this topic, often it isn't easy to kind of have that clarity and that sort of, okay, now it's got to change.
Yeah, I did have, it was one night out, but I always say it was really strange because it definitely wasn't like the worst hangover. It wasn't the worst. It was almost like sometimes when I was so hungover and so anxious, I couldn't deal with it and I would just not think about it. But I think I woke up, I'd done a few embarrassing things that my friends told me about. You know, they said, oh, you were really drunk last night. And I just woke up and I really thought about it. And I just thought, I can't keep living like this. And it was really strange. It was almost, it was just like the nail in the coffin, but it wasn't. Looking back now, it's really hard to understand why it was just that day that I said I'm going to do it. But the only thing I can think of, and I always think this is kind of fate, a few weeks before I went on this night out, I was on the tube to work and I was deathly hungover, and I picked up a copy of Stylist magazine on the tube, and there was an article from a woman called Catherine Gray who was talking about a new book that she was writing called The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober. And I kind of looked at the article and was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. Her story kind of sounded like mine. And then when I woke up when I was really hungover, I was like, I'm going to download that book. So I downloaded it on audiobook and listened to it that day. And something just switched in my brain, because I had never seen, I'd only ever seen people giving up alcohol when they'd kind of reached this like rock bottom that everyone talks about. You know, like I always had this idea of it would be someone drunk on a park bench. It wouldn't be someone who resembled me or whose drinking resembled me. And kind of, I read that and I understood her story. And I thought, well, actually, I can take out of the, like alcohol out of the equation. I can stop. But for some reason in my head, I'd never considered that I could stop, because I was like, oh, I'm a 26-year-old girl. You know, my life revolves around hen dos and parties and things like that. How am I going to go out? I'd never considered that it could be an option to stop drinking. I thought that that was something for other people, that it wasn't something for people like me, that I had to learn to manage it, or I had to learn to drink less or moderate. Total abstinence just didn't seem like a thing. And then when I read this book, it kind of really just something clicked. And I think after that day, I was like, right, I'm going to do this.
How brilliant. So, and how did it translate into sort of a very practical? Did you literally just throw out any bottles in the kitchen, or what did you actually do?
Yeah, I just said, oh, I'm not going to drink. So when all my friends kind of asked me, asked me to go out, I would just say, yeah, but I'm not going to drink. I kind of made it very clear. I wasn't really a home drinker. And I always think that my drinking was purely like binge drinking. I wasn't necessarily like a one drink every night. So I didn't even really have that many bottles to throw out. It was always like me drinking when I was out. So I kind of just said, yeah, I'm just not going to do it anymore. I read loads more books about sobriety. I kind of looked on the internet, read blogs and watched videos and things like that, and just tried to like understand it a bit more. And yeah, practically I always say I was really stubborn. I think it really did me well, and I wouldn't advise it for everyone, but I just said nothing's going to change. So it was my friend's birthday like the next week, and I said, yeah, I'm still going to come out, but I'm just not going to drink. And I think a lot of people can sometimes leave it and say, you know, actually I'm going to wait a bit until I feel more comfortable in my kind of like not drinking. But for me, like pulling off the band-aid, I did that night out really early on and said, actually it was fine, you know, like I had a good time, I can definitely do it again. And I think that kind of served me really well.
Okay, interesting. Because I think, yeah, you know, motivation and where that comes from. To because I mean, maybe people listening were thinking, oh, I wish I could be like Millie. I wish I could do it that easily. Just, you know, somehow go from, as you say, quite a lot of drinking. I mean, was part of the switch that you started to address some of the underlying anxiety? Did you get some therapy or see a doctor about that, or was that a sort of joint double action, as it were?
Yeah, so I kind of tackled them both at the same time. So I went and did therapy. So I did CBT. I still have therapy to this day because I just think it's really important. I've like tailed it off a bit, but you know, I always have like a few check-ins a month just to kind of keep it going. So that was one of the first things that I kind of addressed. And that really helped me. It kind of really calmed down my panic attacks. It really kind of helped with depression and things like that. I'm now on anti-anxiety medication, and that was a decision I kind of made later down the line. But again, that kind of really helped me as well. So those two things, I think, addressing that were so important. And I always think it is a case of doing it kind of at the same time. There's always it's a quote from Professor David Nutt, and he always says he thinks people drink for two reasons. One is to increase pleasure and one is to decrease pain. So I always think that is the key to not drinking, is to find things that increase your pleasure. So I was finding different things that were fun that I enjoyed doing outside of drinking. I took up new hobbies. I kind of reconnected with old hobbies that I used to like before drinking was my like default for fun. And then at the same time, I learned to decrease the pain. So that was like going to therapy, taking, you know, anti-anxiety medication, getting out and, you know, calming down, learning to meditate, things like that. So I kind of addressed both causes at the same time. And I think that was really helpful.
Yeah, I really like that, a sort of left and a right, that you need to sort of think of both things. Do you think it was helpful telling everybody that you weren't going to drink? Because sometimes with sort of motivational change, you know, some people say, you know, that's a really useful device because it kind of, you need a sort of support network of people who are helping you through this. But others say, actually, that puts even more pressure.
Yeah, I think you have to kind of understand what type of person you are and what's going to help you. I always try not to give out like blanket advice because I do think it's different. But for me personally, I thought it held me really accountable because I thought, well, I've put it out there now and I'm quite stubborn. I thought I don't really want to go back on it. I've kind of said it. So me putting it out into the universe, I think, was really important. But I think you can kind of do a mix. I think, you know, if you've got some really close friends that you really trust, you know they're going to be supportive, tell them, but maybe don't tell everyone you work in the office with. I think it's like, work out what is the best thing for you, what's going to help keep you accountable but with the least pressure. But sometimes pressure is good. For me, I think it's good because, you know, I don't want to let people down after I've said that I'm going to do it. So it's not necessarily bad pressure for me. It's pressure that like keeps me accountable. And yeah, I think you have to kind of work out what is best for you in that moment.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I'm sure you're right that this sort of individualized sort of, you know, trying to be back to kind of the idea of being curious about what's the right approach for you, and you know, whether it's better to bring people with you. When you were talking, I was just thinking that I quite like the idea that, you know, you don't want to overly focus on the thing that you're trying to avoid.
Yes.
So maybe there's a halfway house, which is you tell people that you're not drinking, but then you don't want the subject to constantly be drinking, you're drinking, they're drinking. I mean, I don't know if that's a topic for you now, running the Sober Girls Society, that you're on the topic, which is possibly a difficult topic for you.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't mind talking to people about why I don't drink. I think I think we all think these days that when people ask us about the topic, that they're coming from a place of like, I don't know, like hostility, but really I find so many people these days are just curious. When they say, oh, like, how comes you don't drink? It's not they're saying, oh, like, how comes you don't drink? That's boring or weird. They're saying, oh, how comes you don't drink? Like, I've got a friend who doesn't drink, or I've been thinking about it. I did dry January. So I'm quite open to the topic. But I think if you don't want to talk about it, you have to kind of put those boundaries in place. So you don't have to do it in like a negative way or a rude way. You can just say, oh, actually, like, if you don't mind, I really don't want to talk about it for the moment. Like, I just want to kind of see how it goes, don't want to put too much pressure on it. So I think you have to kind of, again, establish what's right for you. How much do you want to divulge when you talk to people? Maybe you don't want to talk about it now, but you might be comfortable talking about it in 6 months' time. I think, again, it's a really like individualized approach of what works best for you, and how much you want to talk about. But I'm an open book at this point. I'll tell anyone, as long as I think, they're asking for the right reasons, and that they're actually quite curious, because I think, well, it might inspire them to make a change.
Yeah, I do really think that probably a lot of the psychological studies say that it really does also make great sense to start focusing on other positives that you enjoy, so like other hobbies and other things that you're doing. And because what we focus on is, we keep making those same neural pathways and thoughts. So if we're constantly focusing on the thing that we're trying to avoid, it keeps being front of mind. I'm intrigued. When you were sort of setting out at the beginning a sort of little kind of resume really of your journey, you said like that this was a slightly different approach to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and that with all respect, that's a great approach for lots of people. But how do you think that you sort of bringing it into the 21st century, as it were, what's different about this? And also the fact that it's just for girls. What are we supposed to do to men listening in?
Yeah, so I think kind of going back to what you were saying about not drinking, not necessarily being the forefront, I think that's a kind of approach we've taken with Sober Girl Society. So we don't necessarily get everyone in a room and get them to talk about their drinking. We actually just try and expand the things outside of that. So we'll do like really fun things just to show girls that they actually can do a night out, they can make friends. We do things like dance classes. So, people say, oh, I could never get on the dance while sober. And we want to say, well, actually you can come along to dance class, we'll show you. So they're just normal activities that don't revolve around drink, but they also don't revolve around the fact that you're a non-drinker. It's just actually come and explore something different. If you want to mix, we always do like mix and mingle afterwards. If you want to chat to people about your story, great, but we don't necessarily stick you in a room and say, right now talk about alcohol, because we don't want that to be the focus. We just want to show actually there's more to life out there than just drinking. So I think that's like one of the first things that we do. I think we don't have that like kind of, you have to be here and you have to be abstinent. We kind of say to people, actually, if you're sober curious, if you're just thinking about cutting down, or if you are a drinker but actually you're just tired of going out every single weekend with your friends and drinking, and you want to do something that doesn't revolve around alcohol, come to one of our events. So we're not kind of like, you have to be this X amount of sober to be here. And
sure,
what you do outside of the events is up to you. We're not a recovery program. We are just a community of girls who want to do fun stuff that don't revolve around alcohol. So that's kind of like the main premise. I started it for women because a lot of women who I spoke to had really negative experiences with men because of their drinking. And so it felt really important for me to create kind of like a really safe space where women would feel very safe. That was kind of like the initial thought behind it. And I also think there are different it is a bit of a sweeping generalization, but a lot of different kind of reasons behind men's drinking. Like there's kind of a school of thought that women drink for more of the emotional reasons, like the stress and the heartbreak and the things like that, whereas men have a harder time giving up because of the social aspects. So like women's friends are more happy to go and do things like, oh, a coffee morning or things like that, whereas most of men's socializing revolves around the pub, and if it's not pub, it's sport, and a lot of that is to do with drink as well. So there were kind of topics that I felt like I wasn't necessarily equipped to speak on necessarily. So I kind of wanted to focus on women because that's what I know, and I wanted to create this kind of safe space. So I think there needs to be a different approach for men, and every man I meet who's a non-drinker, I say, look, you need to start something. But I think it's quite hard, but I do think there needs to be a slightly different approach, because I do think there's a bit of nuance in the reasons behind our drinking, and kind of this whole lad culture. There's a whole separate issue that kind of needs to be tackled individually. So yeah, I think that was one of the reasons why I kept it a Sober Girl Society, but there definitely does need to be something wider.
That's so interesting. And I suppose as someone a bit older, does it have, do you have to be, well, what does it mean, a girl? I mean, is it for older women as well, or is it just for younger women?
Yeah, I mean, we do tend to attract kind of like a younger audience to our meetups, but we are open to everyone and we do get a lot of different people coming. But everything else on the platform is also free to access to anyone, whether you are a man or a woman. So, you know, like you can read the book, we've got blogs, there's all kind of merchandise, there's loads of stuff that's free to access. We've got so many like free resources and things like that, podcasts, things that you can listen to, things that you can watch. So all of that is kind of geared to anyone really. I just think that the meetups, we do tend to attract a certain clientele, but I think it's because of the things that we run, of like, you know, the dance classes, like diva Beyonce workouts and things like that. I just think it attracts a certain clientele, but absolutely everyone is welcome.
Yeah, may I say, I'm just chatting here to Millie Gooch, and her website, I had a real fun noodling around. You have got loads of info on there. Can you give us a sense a bit? Oh, so yeah, sorry. Website being Sober Girls Society. Millie, can you give us a bit of a sense of sort of how big a problem you think this is, and the sort of you know, the extent or the success really of Sober Girls Society, and what does that tell us about how needed this is as a sort of another approach?
Yeah, I do think it is a huge problem. It's really interesting actually, because I'm kind of immersed in what's now happening with like Gen Z, because there now seems to be a bit of a school of thought that drinking is really declining among kind of like younger people, but substance and drug use is perhaps going up. So that's like one separate thing. But I think for people my age, it is still such a big problem, because I think we were raised in that like Geordie Shore kind of tail end of the like Ladette culture of, you know, drinking is female empowerment, and I think we've kind of now learning that that isn't necessarily the case. And I think a lot of us are dealing with mental health issues, addiction issues, and just, you know, relying on alcohol for a lot. We're kind of seeing as well this like mummy wine culture that's really come in, which is I think quite dangerous in itself. So I think it is a huge problem
thing, you know.
Yeah, which is interesting because so originally it kind of came from this really good place. So I think social media is really entrenched in this conversation as well. I think when social media first came about, you had all these like perfect mummy bloggers that were like, you know, doing color coordinated lunches and showing all their like perfect lifestyle. And then we kind of had a pushback against that with some like really authentic kind of mum bloggers who came along and said, well, actually, you know, that's not the case. You know, my child's scrawling on the walls and I'm drinking gin at 4 o'clock. And it kind of came from this good place of showing this like more authentic style of parenting, but it's actually now become like almost a parody of itself, in that, you know, marketers have caught onto this, so they've released mummy juice and, you know, mummy's wine holders and things like that. And it's actually, I think, becoming quite insidious and dangerous now, whereas it did start from a good place. I think that's quite a whole kind of group of people as well that it needs to address, is this kind of like parenting group. Yeah, I think it is a big problem, and I just think we don't like to talk about it, because I think as soon as you start talking about alcohol, you can be seen as judgmental or on your high horse or boring and all those things that I get told, whereas really I think we can't just completely avoid this conversation for fear of looking like you're judgy.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you mentioned there the sort of, you know, drugs versus alcohol. I mean, in your view, because often there's a connection, isn't there? You get drunk first and then you take a drug. How does that work? Is it that I mean, you're not trying to also address people taking drugs, though I suppose some people would say alcohol is a drug. It's a mood altering substance.
Yeah, it is. I think you've got kind of in the millennial kind of era, you've got this kind of like horse and carriage of alcohol and cocaine, which seems to be really common. A lot of people that come to us say, actually, I've stopped drinking because every time I drink, it leads me to cocaine. So that's like one interesting thing. But I think a lot of the younger generation
and sorry to interrupt you, just so we got a bit sense of the sort of population cohort. We're talking about people who are now in their early 30s, is that right?
Yeah, I think like late 20s, early 30s, that kind of more millennial. And then you've got kind of
how old are you now?
30.
So you've sort of lived this exact process.
Yeah, kind of, I think I'm in the middle. So I think like 25 to 35, you know, like people who have gone through university and they're now working in wherever the city may be. So many of those kind of people have gone sober because of their cocaine use. but I think with the younger demographic, so we're talking like 18, 19, this kind of new wave that's coming in, I think a lot of those are actually starting with the substances. So, you know, we've seen like a rise in cannabis, a rise in like benzodiazepines. I think, again, social media has a lot to do with this, because I don't think drinking is the most like, it's not necessarily glamorized drug for kind of their age group. You've got TV programs like Euphoria now coming out that kind of glamorizing more drug use, I would say. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that develops among that kind of like 18, 19-year-old, but that isn't necessarily the demographic that we speak to. But I am going to keep an eye on it and see what's kind of happening. I've got an 18-year-old cousin who keeps me informed.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting that you know, you can't just really talk about one response to alcohol. It is so culturally defined and age defined, and you know, so I'm in my 50s, and how my generation, you know, the when I was at uni, you know, there were just very few drugs around. It was quite exceptional. Very little cocaine, or I don't know, maybe that was just the circles that I was in, but you know, things are so different between the generations, and how, you know, and then a generation older than me, they were hard drinkers in a way that's kind of practically unimaginable, because there was, again, much less drug use around. Millie, that is so interesting. And just back to Sober Girl Society, when you say meetups, I mean, how big is the organization now?
Yeah, so it's quite widespread. So we do a lot of our meetups in London, but we've also started doing them up north. So we've done some in Manchester. We've got one coming up in Cardiff. So yeah, it is quite widespread. And then we also have a lot of threads that we do on our Instagram of kind of connecting people that we can't necessarily put together. So if you're in like the US, you're outside the UK, you can kind of find people in your area on those threads, and then you can kind of make your own thing. So we're not precious about saying, you know, like if you want to sort out your thing, that's fine. We'll just kind of help to hook you up with other people. So we run our kind of like official meetups, but if people want to find friends, we also run like a pen pal scheme. So there's loads of other ways that you can kind of meet people doing the same thing that you're doing.
Fantastic. And so people who are interested, they just go to the website, Sober Girl Society. And so that's interesting. Just a sort of final thing before keeping an eye on, time is whizzing past. And I want to ask you a few last things, but this sort of sense of social support, that presumably is a key part of the success of Sober Girl Society.
I think so. I think it was such a game changer for me because, like I said, even though my friends were really kind of supportive, they didn't get it. So I didn't really have anyone to talk to about those kind of things and what I was going through. Like, especially when I did stop drinking and I had to address all those root causes of things, I was like, oh, I've got all these feelings, you know, is this normal? And I didn't really know who to turn to. And then I made some of my absolute best friends who I just adore, and I get to do loads of fun sober stuff with. Like, I love my existing friends and we have such a good time, but sometimes it is really nice just to go out with my group of sober friends, know that the conversation isn't going to revolve around alcohol at all. No one's even going to mention it. There's no expectation. We can just go out, have a fun time. So I think for me, community is so key for accountability, for support. I just think whatever you're doing, you need to kind of find like-minded people to help you through it. And I think that kind of aspect of AA has been so crucial, that was one of the main things that I wanted to kind of take with this, is that it's like community peer-led support.
Sure. Yeah, so you've sort of got the best of that aspect, but you seem like you look really well. I mean, your mood is, do you feel much better physically now you're not drinking?
Yeah, definitely. Physically, mentally. I always think I don't want to kind of say that, oh, you know, sobriety is this like magic wand, you'll just feel great, you won't suffer with mental health, but I really do think it allows you to kind of dig down and understand yourself more and understand, you know, what makes you tick and, you know, where your problems lie, and then kind of address those rather than just like band-aiding over with this kind of alcohol. So I think it's really allowed me to kind of address the reasons why I started drinking and why my drinking got to the point that it did. So yeah, I feel great.
But it hasn't popped up in another form, because I find, for example, so my husband drinks, and because I don't drink, sometimes I'm sort of like, oh, well, I don't drink, so I'll eat a packet of biscuits.
Yeah,
I mean, it's something I don't do, but I'm conscious that that's something. I mean, I've in fact written a book called The Happy Kitchen, called Good Mood Food, which is about the links between food, what we eat, and our mental health. But just that idea that, you know, if you've got an addictive personality, it's going to pop up somewhere.
Yeah, I regularly keep an eye on it. I think at first it was like shopping, because I had so much more money after I stopped drinking. I'd feel like justifying everything, because I'd say, oh, I could buy that Coke because I don't drink anymore. And then it got to about 3 years and I was like, I think I need to stop doing that. And then it kind of went into work. And thing is, I think we're always going to have things that like we use to distract ourselves or to keep ourselves busy, and I think it's just constantly moderating that, making sure that you're doing a balance and you're not just always working all the time or always exercising all the time. It's just trying to keep everything at kind of like a level playing field. So if I notice myself working too much, I have to say, like, stop working, take a day off, do this, or stop spending so much money. It's just constantly keeping them in check. And I think when you take alcohol out of the equation as well, you're always kind of like clear-headed. You've always kind of got a bit more clarity to just keep an eye on things and just constantly keep refining and rebalancing.
I like that idea of balance. And also maybe it is about acceptance that if we think of addiction as distraction, that when life's painful, which is always going to be at times, you've just got to allow it and accept it and go through that. You mentioned some of the mindful techniques. I use a lot of them just to not distract myself, not go and eat the chocolate cake, not have the glass of wine, allow that, just allow that painful feeling. I always like, what that idea, what we resist persists. So I think for me, that's been a big part of not popping up somewhere else, as it were.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, Millie. Listen, so as you know, we're called Inspire the Mind, and we always sort of wrap up by just asking something that really inspires you and, all this amazing work you're doing and helping other people. I mean, what is this one particular thing that inspires you, gets you up in the morning?
I just think it's the women that come to our meetups, when I meet them and I think, wow, like you've made a decision to like change your life. And I just think that is like incredible that people find that strength from somewhere to kind of go, actually, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to like change my life and I want to live a better life. That for me is what gets me up in the morning. I think I'm doing it for other people. Like it really helped me when I first created it. And I think now I'm in such a good place. I'm like, I want to like kind of give that back and help other people. So it's, when I get messages like, oh, I've done like 3 months sober, I'm like, I'm so proud. So definitely other people.
That's lovely. A sort of help us high.
Well,
listen, anybody listening, that chatting here to Millie Gooch, Sober Girl Society, if you want to check out her website and all the incredible work she's doing about helping us rethink our relationship to alcohol and finding other ways to feel great. And I think Millie's a really great example of that. So thank you, Millie.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to chat to you, sort of help clarify some of my own thoughts. And our next guest on Inspire the Mind, I will be chatting to somebody called Chris Cherry, who is also very inspiring. He has set up an organization, get this right, called You OK Doc. And You OK Doc is trying to help doctors and people in the medical profession look after their own mental health and well-being. And actually, you might start with coming back to Millie, because I know a lot of doctors do turn to alcohol because they have very stressful lives. So join me when I chat to Chris, and just a final thank you to Millie. Thank you very much.
Thank you.